By 1939, Roosevelt's already trying to go back on neutrality policies. He's pressing for the removal of the arms embargo. He doesn't get it, but he's pressing for it. By 1939, though, ultimately, cash and carry of arms is approved. In other words, instead of no longer selling any munitions or war-making objects to belligerent powers, we'll sell them stuff. They got to come and get it, but we'll sell them stuff. We'll sell them war-making or the items and implements of war. In 1940, for the first time in American history, a peacetime draft is engaged in. The Selective Service Act of 1940 begins drafting people, it nationalizes, it federalizes the National Guard, calls them into federal service, and we start a draft in preparation for a war that we're not even fighting yet, which ought to give some people hints on where we might actually wind up being going, or at least where our policymakers are worried that we're going. Roosevelt at this point says the United States does not need to be in a war, but we want to become the so-called arsenal of democracy, the storehouse, the workshop of democracy, providing the weapons for others, aiding all others short of war. In 1940, in response to trying to protect the Panama Canal and also deal with a weakened Britain that we're worried about, we engage in the so-called Destroyers for Bases deal, which you remember from your history class. Very important act. The United States secures a number of 99-year leases on bases in the Caribbean from the British. In exchange for that, we take 50 overage naval vessels that were kind of mothballed and retired, refurbish them, and send them to Britain to allow the British to use them for their own naval service. In a legal sense, most legal scholars argue that Adolf Hitler would have been justified in declaring war on the United States at this point because this is such an overt act of taking one side over another. Needless to say, Hitler has his own interests at this point in time. His interests revolve largely around the conflict in North Africa, particularly stabilizing his situation, controlling Central Europe, and largely what he really wants to do, which is to engage in a conflict with the Bolsheviks and destroy communism in the Soviet Union once and for all. So as such, Hitler lets this slide. By 1941, you can see these steps. Each time the isolationists are getting more and more hysterical about where they think Franklin Roosevelt is leading the country. Highly controversial is the Lend-Lease Act of 1941. At this point, Britain is largely broke. So instead of the war debts issue of the First World War, Roosevelt proposes to Congress that we pass a bill that would allow the United States to lend them military weapons. We wind up lending over $31 billion to England alone, or Britain alone, once this passes. And this was really controversial because now we're essentially actively supporting in any way, shape, or form possible the Allied side. And isolationists say there's no way that we're not going to be in this conflict. In 1941, Hitler attacks Russia. The United States begins sending Lend-Lease materials to the Russians as well. And in that same year, Churchill and Roosevelt meet in secret and draw up the Atlantic Charter, which was sort of a general set of war aims. Now, once again, war aims for a nation, one of whom is fighting the Germans, one of whom is not in the war at all yet. But these war aims in many ways were highly Wilsonian, saying that if there is a conflict the United States would be in with the Allies, the goal should be collective security, disarmament in the post-war world, self-determination of peoples and economic cooperation, and freedom of the seas, that same thing we'd seen from earlier. Roosevelt at this time also authorizes the United States Navy to begin convoying shipments of goods halfway across the Atlantic, well beyond the 12-mile international law limit of ocean territory surrounding a nation. So when the Germans are there, shoot-on-sight orders are given if the German U-boats are spotted and seen by late 41. So by the fall of 41, USFP, on my slide, U.S. foreign policy has come full circle. By the fall of 41, the United States is essentially engaged in an undeclared naval war with German submarines in the North Atlantic. Now, with that being said, the fact that the war starts for the United States on the other side of the globe is really sort of a curious phenomenon. By 1940, the Germans, Italians, and Japanese entered into a formal alliance, the so-called tripartite pact, where an attack against one in their treaty meant an attack against all. It was aimed specifically at the United States. And the Japanese, for their part, began pushing what they call a notion of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. They were going to argue Asia for the Asiatics, which in translation meant Asia for the Japanese. They were going to claim that all of this should be Japan's sphere of influence. That it's okay for the Germans to have that as their sphere of influence. America can have North and South, the United States can have South and Central America as its sphere of influence, but they're saying essentially the imperialist powers that have been here since the 1800s, they should make way for a new imperialist power being Japan, and this is going to be Japan's exclusive sort of economic zone. The United States stands in the way of this. All the other powers don't. By this point in time, the French are occupied by the Germans, the British are fighting for their lives, the Russians are kind of also fighting for their lives. The United States has bases in the Philippines, bases at Wake Island, bases at Guam, and bases in all these islands across the Pacific that are going to stand in the way of this. And of course, a lifeline down to Australia as well. So the Japanese then decide that they're going to have to somehow deal with the Americans. Now, the nature of what they're going to have to do to deal with us is unclear. Can this be negotiated away, or is it going to call for sterner measures? As we've talked about in earlier units, going all the way back to the Great White Fleet, going all the way back to the Gentleman's Agreement, going all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt intervening to stop Japan from getting as much as they could have gotten out of the 1904 Russo-Japanese War. There's an undercurrent of discontent and suspicion and resentment among the Japanese government towards the United States. This is only exacerbated in the summer of 1941, when Franklin Roosevelt freezes all Japanese assets in the United States and places a ban on aviation gasoline, petroleum products, and scrap metal going to Japan in reply to all their activities in the conquest of China that they're engaged in. At that point in time, summer of 41, a clock starts ticking. Japan will have about 6 to 8 months to either, at that point, knuckle under and withdraw their troops from China, which is what the United States wants, or they're going to have to declare war because they don't have enough fuel and resources to sustain their economy any further. If they go to war, they can take those things. These are the steps that ultimately then lead to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese sail a fleet 3,000 miles across the ocean, undetected, all the way off my map over to here, and engage in the greatest surprise attack that America has faced, with the possible exception of 9/11 attacks in our history. On that day, some 2,400 Americans are killed, 8 battleships are sunk, and the key to this was, in many ways, we underestimated the Japanese. We underestimated their skills and capabilities and capacity, and also thought their attacks were all going to come in other places. We misjudged and misread them. We thought they'd attack in the Far East. This lightning blow knocks out the American Pacific Fleet initially, and in so doing, it allows Japan to run free and run wild over an awful lot of Southeast Asia. But it has an unintended consequence as well. The famous phrase, to awake the sleeping giant, sort of happens. It unites Americans in a patriotic sense of purpose. And the war is going to now be prosecuted as a fight to the finish. To sum up, though, in conclusion, all this 1930s, 1920s diplomacy, where did it go? At the end of the day, all the economic and non-military means to achieve peace seem to have failed. You could make an argument that the Neutrality Acts were passed one war too late. The Neutrality Acts would have done a great job of keeping us out of the First World War, but this is the Second World War. Adolf Hitler is not Kaiser Wilhelm I, and there's a significant argument to be made that he would stop at nothing, no matter how much you appeased him. And so the United States had to defend itself overseas, and Roosevelt, through changing and making these modifications, in all the assessment of historians, sort of accurately perceived that the rise of the fascists and the Axis nations were indeed a threat to Western civilization. And now at this point, the Second World War is upon us.